Okay, so I think essentially the most important thing is it's a love story. It's set in the Second World War. There's a bit set in Leningrad in the late 20s. And I think really it's about how two, in a way, very different people, one who grew up in Russia, one who grew up in Venice, are thrown together by fate, I guess, during the war. How they meet, the impact that has on them and on their lives, and eventually how they might meet again. Well, very initially, it was a long time ago, I think it was 2000, and I borrowed a book from the library in Oxford called, I think it was called The Meaning of Life. It was a Time Life book, and it was basically a load of photographs and quotes from a range of different people, both some famous people and just ordinary people, and really just talking about what life really meant to them and what was the most important thing for them. And there was one particular quote that stood out for me and really struck a chord in me, I think. I won't read out the whole quote now, but basically it was that quote that I'd been thinking about writing a book anyway, and that's something I'd always wanted to do, and around about that time, in my early 30s, I think I felt I'd better get on with it if I was ever going to do it. And this particular quote really summed up the essence of the kind of thing I thought I'd like to write about. And the last 4 words of the quote are the art of waiting, and that's really where it originated. The 2 main settings of the book are Venice specifically in terms of Italy, and then Russia. There's an element of the story set in Leningrad, and then a large part of it as well is set on the Eastern Front during the war. And I mean, in terms of why that was of interest to me at that time, I'd always had an interest in the Second World War when I was a kid. I grew up in the 70s, had an action man, an army uniform, all of that kind of thing. Used to read the war comics, and back in around 2000, I'd started reading about the Second World War again, and I think the first book I picked up was Antony Beevor's Stalingrad, and I also read a couple of books by Italians, one Curzio Malaparte, and that was The Vulgarizers in Europe, who was an Italian journalist who was in Russia during the Second World War and also on the Finnish front. And also The Sergeant in the Snow, which is a memoir by a member of the Italian Alpini who actually was lucky enough to make it back to Italy towards the end of the war. So all these things came together, I guess. And then it was a case of fitting together all those elements, the quote, Russia, Italy, particularly Venice, into a love story, essentially. In terms of research, there's a lot you can do on the internet these days, and there are a lot of websites which are specifically around certain regiments of the Italian army who were over there during the war, and really about this whole issue. There are lots of first-hand accounts that you can find on the internet, people who came back and what it was like for them when they were repatriated, as well as what it was like when they were there. And I think the book has that element as well, not just the experience when they were there in Russia during the war, but also when they got home again. You're influenced by lots of people you meet, and the characters are probably an amalgamation of different people who you've known or you've read about possibly in other books as well to some extent, without you being aware of it. So this Fausto Pozzi character, I'm not sure who he would have been based on, but he's a certain type of person, obviously. And I think the fact that he contrasts with the Luca character in terms of their outlook on life and the kind of things that they value is probably quite a good thing to compare. Well, I think the first thing is you would want it to be an engaging story that they feel they can immerse themselves in and that takes them into the lives of the characters. I think every story in a way is a love story, and this is definitely intended to be a love story. I think also the historical elements, I've tried to make sure that it's factually accurate in terms of what happened during the war to the Italians in Russia. And I guess that's a part of the Second World War that, at least in the UK, probably hasn't been particularly thoroughly covered. So it might be new for certain readers, that aspect, the fact the Italians were in Russia and the kind of things that happened, and maybe what life would have been like for those who were lucky enough to make it home afterwards. And I think returning back to a place that you know well because you've grown up there, but then you find that things have changed a lot in the interim and that you yourself have changed, and so you go back and you find that it's a place that you recognise but it's not really yours anymore, and maybe you are no longer yourself anymore either. So in terms of the settings, I think there's hopefully a nice contrast between the two main settings, one being Venice, and I guess roughly 2/3 of the book is set in Venice in the 1930s, 40s, and just at the start of the 1950s. And I found when I first went to Venice on honeymoon, and then when I went back after that on various occasions, the atmosphere of the place just seeps into you. And what I've tried to do in terms of the scenes that take place in the part of the book that takes place in Venice is really get across the atmosphere of what it's like to be in Venice. And I think Venice almost helps you in any role, but as a writer in that sense, because I remember the first feeling I had when I stepped off the train at Venice Station and then crossed the bridge into the old part of town it was like going back in time. So in a sense it's almost like you're experiencing it as it used to be, even though it's in the modern day. And I think that really helps as you're trying to absorb the atmosphere to then recreate it in the scenes in the book. So in terms of the contrast between the different settings, so Venice is very much around... Venice has a certain air of melancholy about it, obviously, but there's also a lot of joy in terms of the kind of life that's described there, as well as hardship, but certainly joy. And then the contrast with the prisoner of war camp, where the Italians end up, is obviously very extreme. And I think I've always been drawn to stories which are about strength in adversity and survival against the odds and that kind of thing. And I think just in terms of, the research that I did on that side of the book, just reading about what really happened to those people and the depths of despair that they must have fallen to, and then to rise again from that. And in the book it's just one small incident, a chance encounter, that really plants this little seed of hope again in the heart of the key character and allows him to survive and to eventually perhaps make it home again. I think having that contrast between the joy of his home life and where he's ended up as a result of the war, and really being put there as a result of a system which pays no regard for the individual and the suffering of the individual. Adversity, and then hope and love, then adversity again, and then possibly hope and love once more after that. Writing the book, I think it's something that you learn as you go along. I always read a lot when I was younger, particularly when I was younger, and I used to write little stories when I was a kid and that kind of thing. And then I knew that one day I wanted to try to have a serious attempt at writing. But I think you always feel that you need a bit more experience of life before you try that. So I left it until my early 30s anyway. And then I think it's a bit of a voyage of discovery in terms of the actual writing, where you set off, you don't really know what you're doing, how you're meant to be doing it. I've never done a creative writing course or gone to writers' groups or anything like that. It's always been a very solitary activity and something that was just something I did for myself and didn't really talk about. So I guess I learned it as I went along, and you learn from your mistakes, I guess, in a way. And I know that you always read advice about not sending anything out to agents until it's really ready, and of course I didn't follow that advice. So I think I sent it out a couple of different drafts that really weren't ready. So it did take quite a long time. And I went through different phases in terms of the actual writing as well. So I'd write a draft, send it out, didn't get anywhere, left it for a while, would then go back again, redo it, and then go through that process again. And then, fortunately, eventually I found an agent, and I think it was only at that point really that I had a realistic chance of finding a publisher. So it's great once you've actually found a publisher to have the editorial input and to have the publisher also investing their time in making it a better book, and that means that doing that together, it'll turn out better than if you're doing it on your own.